Paris, 1961. A young Soviet ballet star stands inside an airport terminal, surrounded by men who are not dancers. They don't carry instruments, they don't carry costumes, they carry authority. They smile, but their eyes never stop watching. In his pocket, Rudolf Nureyev holds a passport that doesn't truly belong to him, because in the Soviet Union, your passport wasn't proof of freedom, it was proof of ownership. Behind him, a plane is waiting, not to take him home, but to take him back into silence, back to Moscow, back to interrogation rooms, back to punishment disguised as discipline. Because in the USSR, when the government suddenly calls you back, it's rarely a request, it's a warning. And Rudolf Nureyev knew one terrifying truth: if he gets on that plane, he may never dance again. So he does something unthinkable, something that could destroy his career, his family, his entire life. He breaks away from the Soviet officials and runs straight toward the French police. And in a trembling voice, he asks for asylum. What happened next became one of the most shocking cultural defections of the Cold War, and it turned a Soviet dancer into a global legend overnight. Welcome to Inside the USSR. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union didn't only fight the West with weapons, it fought with culture. Ballet was one of the USSR's greatest propaganda tools, a symbol of discipline, perfection, and Soviet superiority. But one man became too talented, too independent, too impossible to control. His name was Rudolf Nureyev, and his escape from the Soviet Union wasn't just a story about dance, it was a story about freedom and the terrifying price of choosing it. A star. The USSR didn't trust to understand why Nureyev's escape shocked the world. You have to understand one simple truth about the Soviet Union. The Soviet government didn't trust anyone. Not journalists, not workers, not even artists. And certainly not artists who were famous. Because fame was dangerous. Fame meant influence, and influence meant power. And in the USSR, power belonged to only one thing: the state. A Soviet artist could become rich, respected, and admired, but only as long as they stayed obedient, only as long as they never questioned the system, only as long as they never became too free. And Rudolf Nureyev was not the obedient type. He wasn't quiet, he wasn't grateful, he wasn't the kind of man who smiled and bowed just because he was told to. He wanted more, and in the Soviet Union, wanting more was suspicious, it was selfish, it was Western, it was dangerous. Even as a young dancer, officials saw him as a risk, not because he was weak, but because he was powerful, and the USSR feared powerful people who weren't under control. Born into a world of poverty and fear. Rudolf Nureyev was born in 1938, and according to many accounts, he wasn't even born in a hospital. He was born on a train, a moving train somewhere in the Soviet Union. Even his first breath happened under motion, under noise, under uncertainty. His family lived in poverty. His childhood was shaped by hardship, strict rules, and Soviet reality. This was the era of Stalin's shadow, a time when fear lived inside every apartment. People didn't speak freely, they whispered. They didn't trust neighbors, they didn't trust co-workers, and they certainly didn't trust the government. But they pretended to, because in the USSR, pretending could save your life. Rudolf grew up in a world where everything was controlled: what you learned, what you read, what you believed. The Soviet Union didn't just want citizens, it wanted loyal citizens, and loyalty wasn't optional, it was survival. But Rudolf was different. He wasn't born to blend in. Even as a boy, he had a restless energy. He was stubborn, he argued, he refused to accept limits, and in a society built on obedience, that kind of personality was like fire near gasoline. Dance became his escape. When Rudolf discovered ballet, it wasn't just art, it was an escape route. Because when he danced, something incredible happened. The world disappeared. The poverty, the fear, the Soviet rules, all of it faded. For a few minutes, his body was free, and in the USSR, freedom was the most addictive drug. Rudolf trained obsessively. He wasn't just talented, he was hungry. Hungry for greatness, hungry for recognition, hungry for a life that felt bigger than the Soviet cage he was born into. But Soviet ballet schools were brutal. Students were trained like soldiers, strict schedules, harsh teachers, physical pain, and the system rewarded discipline above everything else. But Rudolf didn't want to be disciplined. He wanted to be alive. He wanted his dance to feel dangerous, and that was exactly what made him extraordinary. Because when Nureyev danced, you didn't just see technique, you saw emotion, you saw rebellion, you saw a man trying to break invisible chains. The Kirov Ballet. Beauty under surveillance. Eventually, Nureyev reached the top. He joined the legendary Kirov Ballet in Leningrad. This was one of the greatest ballet institutions in the world. To be accepted there meant you were elite. It meant the Soviet system had chosen you, but it also meant something else. You were now under the eyes of the state. The Kirov Ballet wasn't only about performance, it was about propaganda. Soviet ballet tours were political missions. When dancers performed abroad, they represented the USSR. They represented communist success. And the government wanted the West to believe, look how beautiful we are, look how disciplined we are, look how perfect our system is. But behind the curtain, the reality was darker. Dancers were watched. Their conversations were monitored. Their friendships were suspicious. Their personal lives were controlled, because the USSR didn't just export ballet, it exported an image, and that image could not be allowed to crack. Rudolf Nureyev quickly became the brightest star of the Kirov. Audiences loved him, but Soviet officials feared him, because he wasn't just brilliant, he was unpredictable. He spoke too freely, he loved attention, he loved foreign ideas, and worst of all, he didn't seem afraid. In the Soviet Union, fear was expected, so when someone wasn't afraid, the government saw danger. The West was forbidden, and that made it irresistible. To most Soviet citizens, the West was a fantasy. They saw it only through propaganda. The government told them, the West is poor, the West is immoral, the West is collapsing. But deep down, people didn't believe it. They heard whispers. They saw foreign movies when they could. They listened to forbidden radio stations. And they wondered, what is the truth? Rudolf Nureyev didn't just wonder. He wanted to see it. He wanted to feel it. He wanted to live it. And when the Kirov Ballet planned a tour to Western Europe, it was like destiny knocking. Because for Rudolf, travel wasn't just travel. It was a chance to step outside the Soviet world and breathe. But the Soviet government knew that travel could change a person, because once you see the outside world, you can't unsee it. And some people never return. So officials decided, if Nureyev travels, he must be watched closely, constantly. The tour, dancing with invisible handcuffs. Round 1961, Nureyev traveled with the Kirov Ballet to Paris, and at first, everything looked normal. The performances were stunning, the applause was loud, the Soviet Union looked glorious, but behind the scenes, the tension was building, because Rudolf didn't behave like a Soviet citizen. He didn't follow the strict rules, he didn't stay isolated, he didn't avoid foreigners. Instead, he did the forbidden thing. He made friends. He went out, he talked, he explored, and for Soviet officials, this was terrifying, because Soviet travelers were supposed to act like robots, smile, perform, return, nothing more. But Rudolf wanted to taste the West, and the West welcomed him. He walked through Paris like a man waking up from a nightmare. The city was alive, the streets were full of color, people spoke freely, they laughed loudly, they weren't afraid of being overheard, and Rudolf noticed something shocking. No one was watching, no one was following him, no one was reporting his conversations. For the first time in his life, he felt invisible, and that invisibility felt like freedom. Paris, the moment his life changed, Paris wasn't just beautiful, it was dangerous, because Paris showed Rudolf what the Soviet Union had stolen from him. Choice. In the West, you could choose what to eat, what to wear, where to go, who to love, who to speak to. In the Soviet Union, you didn't choose, you were assigned. Rudolf saw stores filled with products. He saw cafes full of life. He saw people living without fear. And he realized something deeply painful. The USSR had lied, not only about politics, but about reality itself. The Soviet Union had told its people, "You have the best system in the world," but Paris was proof that the Soviet system was not the best. It was a cage, and Rudolf Nureyev was a man who could not survive in a cage. He began to imagine a life outside, a life where his talent belonged to him, a life where he could dance without being owned. But dreaming of that life was dangerous, because Soviet officials were watching him closely now. His behavior was becoming unacceptable. He was too excited, too curious, too Western, and in the USSR, Western curiosity was treated like betrayal, the order that felt like a death sentence. Then the order came, suddenly, coldly. Rudolf Nureyev was told he must return to Moscow immediately. Not after the tour, not later, immediately. Officially, the Soviet officials claimed it was for a special performance, but Rudolf understood the truth. This was not about performance. This was about punishment, because in the Soviet Union, when you are suddenly called back, it means you've been marked. It means someone has written your name in a file, and once your name is in that file, your future becomes a question mark. Rudolf imagined what would happen when he returned. A room with no windows, men asking questions, a cold voice saying, "Why did you speak to foreigners? Why did you go out at night? Why do you act like you don't respect the Soviet Union?" And in the USSR, answers didn't matter, because guilt was decided before the questions were asked. Rudolf knew the Soviet system didn't need to kill him. It could destroy him quietly. It could erase his career, ban him from the stage, remove his name, turn him into a nobody. And for a man like Nureyev, that would be worse than death. The airport. 10 seconds of courage. The tour group traveled to the airport. The Soviet officials stayed close. Too close. They surrounded him like guards surrounding a prisoner. They planned to escort him directly onto the plane. No detours, no conversations, no hesitation. And Rudolf Nureyev felt something terrifying. This was it. This was the last moment of his life as a free man. Once he boarded that plane, the Soviet Union would close around him again, like a door slamming shut. His mind raced. He thought of his future. He thought of the stage. He thought of Moscow. He thought of the silence waiting for him. And then he made a decision. A decision so bold it shocked the entire world. He broke away from the Soviet officials. He ran. Not like a dancer, not like an artist, but like a man escaping a trap. He ran through the airport terminal toward French police officers, and in that moment his voice shook, his hands trembled, but his words were clear. He asked for asylum, he asked for protection, he asked for freedom. The Soviet officials were stunned. They tried to pull him back, but it was too late. French authorities stepped in, and suddenly the Soviet Union lost control. In the Cold War, this wasn't just an escape, it was an international humiliation, because Rudolf Nureyev wasn't just a dancer, he was a symbol, a Soviet star defecting on Western soil, and the West understood immediately. This wasn't about ballet, this was about truth. Instantly a traitor. After his defection, the Soviet government reacted with rage. Within days, Rudolf Nureyev was declared a traitor. His name was erased from Soviet newspapers. His story was rewritten, because the USSR couldn't allow people to believe that a Soviet citizen could be happier outside the system. That would destroy the illusion. So they labeled him the worst thing possible, a betrayer, a man who abandoned his homeland, a man corrupted by Western influence. But the Soviet punishment didn't end with Rudolf. In the USSR, the government rarely punished only one person. It punished families, it punished friends, it punished anyone connected to the crime, because fear works best when it spreads. And for years, Rudolf's family lived under pressure, under suspicion, under the quiet weight of government surveillance. Imagine the pain of knowing your freedom has a cost, and someone you love might be paying it. the West's new legend. In the West, Rudolf Nureyev became an icon. The media couldn't stop talking about him. The story was too perfect. A Soviet star escapes. A genius chooses freedom. A dancer defects in the middle of the Cold War. He joined the Royal Ballet. He performed in major theaters across Europe and America. And his partnership with the famous ballerina Margot Fonteyn became legendary. Their performances weren't just dance. They were electric, because Rudolf danced like someone who had survived something, like someone who understood fear, like someone who had escaped a cage. Audiences felt it. They didn't just watch him, they believed him. But behind the applause, Rudolf carried a quiet sadness, because even though he had escaped the Soviet Union had not escaped him. The loneliness of freedom. Here's the part of the story that many people don't understand. Defection wasn't only victory, it was also exile. Rudolf gained freedom, but he lost home. He gained the world, but he lost the streets of his childhood. He gained applause, but he lost the ability to return safely. Imagine becoming a legend and still being unable to hug your mother without fear. Imagine hearing Russian spoken in a foreign city and feeling both comfort and pain at the same time. Because freedom is not always joyful. Sometimes freedom is lonely. Because freedom means you chose your path, and you must live with the consequences. Rudolf Nureyev became one of the greatest ballet dancers in history. But deep down, he was still the boy from the Soviet Union who had once danced to escape, and now, even as a free man, he still carried the scars of being owned. The loneliness of freedom. Here's the part of the story that many people don't understand. Defection wasn't only victory, it was also exile. Rudolf gained freedom, but he lost home. He gained the world, but he lost the streets of his childhood. He gained applause, but he lost the ability to return safely. Imagine becoming a legend and still being unable to hug your mother without fear. Imagine hearing Russian spoken in a foreign city and feeling both comfort and pain at the same time. Because freedom is not always joyful. Sometimes freedom is lonely. Because freedom means you chose your path and you must live with the consequences. Rudolf Nureyev became one of the greatest ballet dancers in history. But deep down, he was still the boy from the Soviet Union who had once danced to escape. And now, even as a free man, he still carried the scars of being owned. The USSR begins to fall, and time runs out. Years passed. The Soviet Union began to weaken. The world changed. But Rudolf's story remained powerful because he represented something the USSR could never control: the desire to leave, the desire to breathe, the desire to live a life chosen by yourself. Eventually, near the end of his life, Nureyev was able to return briefly to the Soviet Union, but by then the USSR was collapsing, and he was no longer the young man who ran through an airport. He was older, weaker, and carrying the weight of decades. He returned not as a Soviet citizen, but as a world legend, and perhaps that was the most painful irony of all. The USSR had tried to control him, and instead it created a myth, the moment that changed history. Rudolf Nureyev's defection wasn't just a ballet story, it was a human story, a story about a man who refused to let the state own his life. In the Soviet Union, freedom wasn't something you could ask for politely. Freedom was something you had to take, and taking it could cost everything. In 1961, at a Paris airport, Nureyev took that risk, and with one decision, one run, one terrifying moment, he became more than a dancer. He became a symbol of escape, a reminder that even the most powerful system in the world cannot imprison the human spirit forever. So here's a question for you. If you were Rudolf Nureyev, would you have done the same? Would you have risked your career, your family, your homeland, for one chance at freedom? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more unforgettable stories from Soviet life, stories filled with fear, truth, survival and courage, subscribe to Inside the USSR, because history isn't just about governments, it's about the people who dared to run. Inside the USSR, true stories from behind the Iron Curtain, Would you have escaped like Nureyev or stayed to protect your family?